Hey, all you wiretappers. Good to be back here in studio of Gangland Wire. This is Gary Jenkins. I'm a retired Kansas City, Missouri Police Intelligence Unit detective, now turned podcaster. And I have a little bit different story today. It's not about the mob. We'll get back to the mob next week, but it's not about the mob, but it's about something I find fascinating. That's the trafficking of stolen artifacts. So we've done other stories where mob guys been involved in stealing high famous paintings and things like that, and what they do with them. Usually they just disappear into the netherworld. Today I have a man, Matthew Campbell. Matthew has done a study on this and written a book. The book is The Man Who Stole the Gods, a true story of war obsession and a global art conspiracy. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you for having me, Gary.
This really sounds interesting. Like I told you, I usually do the mob, but the publicist teaser, if you will, in the book that you sent me, it got me interested in this. I'm really interested in what happens to this stuff. Are there these secretive art collectors out there that buy stuff and then never show it to anybody, or how does that work? And you really have gone deep into this in the Southeast Asia area, Cambodia in particularly, and out of Vietnam and the Khmer Rouge situation over there. Why there's really a lot of stolen artifacts that came out of there. And you found a man named Douglas Latchford, Dynamite Doug, telling his story. So Matthew, tell us a little bit about yourself, and then launch into tell us about Dynamite Doug.
So I am a journalist. I have a day job at Bloomberg. I'm based in Southeast Asia, where I've been for most of the last decade. And I do a lot of crime and corruption stories. And in 2019, so this is going back a long way, I saw the news that this British art dealer had been indicted federally in New York City on fraud and conspiracy charges. And I thought, that's interesting. And then I began reading more about the case, and it got really interesting the more I read about it, because this is a guy who'd been accused of basically orchestrating one of the biggest art heists ever and trafficking what was stolen into the US largely. So it was this huge, complex DOJ investigation that had gone on at that point for 7 years. It ultimately took about 10, 11 years. And just has so many interesting moving parts, and rooted in the part of the world where I live, which is Southeast Asia. So it just had every ingredient, I thought, for a great book.
Not really. You could go to local sources as well as get the government documents, which would be nice
Yeah.
since you're there on top of it. So this guy, he like the main defendant in this, Douglas Latchford?
He was the center of it. There were other people involved. There have been several cases in both state and federal court relating to this whole affair. But yeah, this one dealer, Douglas Latchford, who lived his whole career in Thailand and was basically the leading art dealer for artifacts coming out of Southeast Asia. He was the guy. So if you go to a place like the Metropolitan Museum in New York, which is very important to the story, their Southeast Asian works in large part came from him. So he was a really prominent figure in this kind of small and obscure and weird world.
Dynamite Doug in Southeast Asia his whole life. Did he come out of some kind of CIA operations or war over there?
So he was a Brit. He was born in Bombay, as it then was, in the last days of the Raj. And he was not a spy, although Bangkok in the 60s, he got there in 1956 and lived there until he died, 2020. Bangkok in the 60s was spy central, basically. There were intelligence people or people who were in some way connected to intelligence absolutely all over the place because, of course, what was going on not so far away, the Vietnam War. And Bangkok was the hub, certainly for the CIA. And of course, the Eastern Bloc powers were also running agents there. So it was this fascinating, shadowy world that Latchford was in. And some of his fellow dealers and collectors absolutely were spies.
Yeah, interesting. And in that spy world, you'll have these criminals, quasi-criminals, drug dealers, smugglers of all types that the CIA and the intelligence people use. And so I'm sure there was some crossover with
Oh, of course.
the people
Yeah.
he worked with in the spy agencies.
Yeah, not necessarily an antiquities story. We know lots now about the connections between CIA and various drug trafficking operations in that part of the world in the 60s and 70s that made themselves useful to the American government in one way or another. It was a very shadowy time. And actually, one of the fun things I got to do for the book was track down some of the old time American expats from that period. some of whom are still around, most of them actually still living in Bangkok, and hear some of their stories, which are just wonderful.
Yeah, I bet. I bet it was. So Dynamite Doug, how did he get that moniker?
So, Cambodia, we'll zoom out a bit. A lot of listeners will have seen or perhaps even visited Angkor Wat,
Yeah.
which is this amazing temple complex in Cambodia. It's the biggest religious structure in the world, way bigger than the Vatican. It's totally amazing. If you ever have the chance to go, you should. It's one of about 4,000 archaeological sites in Cambodia, all of which, and I do mean all, every single one, were cleaned out of basically all of the art they contained. They would have once included these huge stone and bronze sculptures, and they are all gone. And they were stolen largely during the Cambodian Civil War, which was an offshoot of the Vietnam War, began in the late 60s, but lasted, unlike the Vietnam War, until 1998. And the looting continued right up until the end. And the reason Douglas Latchford got the moniker Dynamite Doug was the looters, whose works he was responsible for getting out of Asia and selling onto the US market. They had to get these huge stone pieces out of the buildings where they were. And you could do that with chisels, you can do that with jackhammers, or you can do it with explosives. And sometimes they did use explosives.
They must have had been pretty good with explosives, getting them in the right place to without shattering it totally, but yet break it free and maybe break it in half, and then they could put it back together.
Sometimes they did shatter it totally. And a lot of these
Really?
pieces arrived in New York or in London with a head and a torso separated or missing their feet, missing their arms. It was a really violent process, violent against the objects, but also violent against people because this was a major lucrative criminal enterprise over a long period of time in a country that was awash in weapons. So there were turf battles between gangs of looters. There were episodes in the 90s where you had looters bursting into storage facilities with rocket propelled grenades and heavy weapons and killing guards. So this was a dirty business.
Yeah. You always think of Southeast Asia, think of these warlords out there that have these groups and that do different things. You're really painting a picture of this dark and dangerous world with warlords and smugglers running all over the place. And this guy operated like a ghost or something right in the middle of all that, it sounds.
The thing with wars, and the one thing that every war has in common is they all need money. No money, no war. And in Cambodia, in this 30-year conflict, everybody needed to fund themselves. And there are three ways to fund yourself in Cambodia, basically. It's gemstones, timber, and ancient artifacts. And ancient artifacts are probably the most lucrative of those. And then, of course, in addition to that, you have just opportunistic thieves who take advantage of chaos, which happens every time there's an armed conflict.
So now, did Latchford have a smuggling network that he established, and how did that work?
So he had a network that extended up to the Thai-Cambodian border and over to brokers just inside Cambodia. And the brokers would then interface with the looting crews who actually went into temple sites. And information would pass up and down the chain. So Latchford would say, I'm looking for pieces of such and such a description. Can you go find some? And the looters would try. But Latchford's really crucial function was there's a criminologist who studied him he's what's called a Janus figure. He's someone with two faces. One face is pointed up to the source country and to the looting crews, the guys with the dynamite and the jackhammers. And the other face, and this is where Latchford gets really interesting, is pointed down to the downstream market. So Latchford was a unique figure in that he had these connections to the looting sites in Cambodia, but also to places like the Met in New York and to very wealthy American buyers who were spending millions and tens of millions of dollars on these pieces.
I guess people would buy them for not only to show off to their friends for their collection, but also maybe as an investment because they will increase in value. It's a really interesting world. And you have to establish some provenance. You have to, especially anything that comes from a war zone, everybody is looking at with the jaundiced eye to make sure they don't get caught out and caught dirty. So how did he deal with that?
That's true now. That was less true
Oh, really?
in the 80s and 90s, a lot less true in the 70s, although there were still basic requirements. And what Latchford did, and this is ultimately a big part of what got him done on federal fraud charges was he faked documents. So he would make sure that these pieces were sold attached to fake paperwork, saying they'd been out of Cambodia longer than they actually had been, saying they'd been exported on a different date, that they'd been in the possession of someone who'd actually either never existed or never had the pieces. And that allowed the buyers to satisfy themselves that they were legit. One question you could ask is, should the buyers have done more due diligence? And I think that's very debatable. But Latchford did provide basic paperwork, which was in many cases, forged.
Yeah. But enough for the Met to say, okay, we've got this paperwork and
Yeah,
we're good.
exactly. And
Alcatraz or somebody like that.
yeah, ultimately the DOJ investigated a lot of this, including the Met. And what they found was there had been paperwork. It had been very flimsy, but that was enough. And no one really had any incentive to look deeper.
Really. And I mentioned earlier about these secret collectors out there. And I see you've got something about a billionaire financer named Leon Black, who has a huge Khmer art collection from Cambodia. So can you tell us about, and even connected to the Epstein files? Let's get topical here. So tell us about that.
This is something that actually I didn't know at the time when I was finishing the book. I wish I had. It would have made a great addition, but we keep finding out about more of these collections. So there's a distinction between objects that are in museums, because obviously you can go see them. Museums publish catalogs online. We know where they are. Whereas private collections, unless someone decides for whatever reason to publicize them, it might be a totally secret, known only to them or people who visit their home, whatever. So bit by bit, we keep finding out about more of these really large Cambodian collections. One of them belongs to Leon Black, who is a very wealthy financial titan in New York City who was very close to Jeffrey Epstein. And his connections to Epstein had been picked over by probably 100 reporters at this point. And in the Epstein files, the big dump of emails and documents, one thing we learned is that a huge amount of Leon Black's kind of business and personal correspondence was getting CC'd to Epstein. So it ended up in Epstein's inbox. And there were right there records of his purchases of statues from Cambodia, some of which have clear connections to Latchford. So that was an interesting little revelation. And it had been heavy spending. He'd spent, I think it was something like $30 million on these pieces.
Wow. It's crazy. It's crazy. I kind of have to think about this on the street level, if you will, or the jungle level. This kind of, I'm sure it's a violent, tough world of these looting gangs that go in and they're probably in competition with each other and competition with the local authorities that steal this stuff, and then they end up in the Met. It's huge contrast that I find fascinating as heck.
Yeah, that's one of the things that drew me to this story is it literally runs, and this sounds crazy, but it actually does literally directly run from the Khmer Rouge killing fields to Fifth Avenue in Manhattan.
Yeah.
Which I've never come across something like that before, and I doubt I ever will again.
Yeah. Yeah, because even like the drug networks, the China White, the opium and everything comes out of the Golden Triangle. It just ends up on the streets in New York, but this ends up on Fifth Avenue, like you said.
Very nice streets. Yeah.
Very nice. I was just in much nicer streets.
I was just in the Golden Triangle. We can talk about that later. That's the world I know well.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
So we've all heard of the Golden Triangle. I just used it like I knew something about it.
Yeah.
I know that it's a part where three countries, I think, come together: Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, maybe up in that area. Tell us about
So the Golden
that.
Triangle, this is such a fun and interesting sideshow. Nothing to do with the book, but very interesting. And I've spent a lot of time working in this part of the world. So Golden Triangle is the very top of Thailand, where the borders of Thailand, Laos, and Myanmar all meet.
Okay.
And there's actually a spot where you can walk up a little hill and you can see all three countries. And what's interesting about the Golden Triangle is it's always been lawless in the way that peripheral places can be. It's a long way from the capitals of all three of those countries. And it's been a safe haven for organized crime since the 50s, basically, because it's a place you can set up, you can buy off local officials, you can move drugs. So the big business there was heroin for a long time. Then it became meth. Now it's something completely different, which is scam centers, like scam compounds, where you have thousands of people ringing up people in the US or people in Europe to try to get them to make fake crypto investments. And a reality of our world is borders are really tough to deal with for law enforcement.
Yeah.
When something's over the border, you can't touch it. And that's true for the US, that's true for Thailand, it's true for everybody. And that's what criminals in that part of the world have been counting on for 75 odd years now.
What was one of the more interesting pieces that ended up, say, in the Met? That is there a story about that then the government found, hey, pointed out, hey, this was stolen?
Yeah, so there were a number of pieces that Latchford either sold or handled that went directly from him or from him through kind of one other layer of transactions right into the Met, where you could see them on Fifth Avenue in the most important museum in the US. And they, in 2011, got to investigating a different piece, which had come through Sotheby's. And they were able to determine where it had come from, this temple called Khmer. And the Cambodians, as part of this investigation, excavated the site because we could only see sort of small parts of what there was. We didn't know everything that was there. And when they dug down a few feet, they found a large number of empty pedestals, over a dozen empty pedestals, which had on them, and there are incredible photos of this, broken off feet, stone feet, or broken off lower limbs in stone. And with modern software, you can do amazing things. For example, you could take a 3D image of something from the Met and you can superimpose it onto an image of this broken pedestal and see, for example, where the legs line up. And so that's this incredible moment where you think, oh my God, we know exactly where this was stolen from. And thanks to interviews of people in the area, investigators were able to figure out exactly when it was stolen. And those pieces, the answer was in the mid 80s. And the Met had to give them back because it just was not a good look.
Yeah, that was my next question. Then what's that procedure? What happens then when you go to this world-class museum that's managed by the top art people in the world and has the most richest donators, supporters in the world? How does that work then? You have to approach that a little bit gingerly, but you got to do something. How does that work?
There's a few ways it can go down. Sometimes, and we should acknowledge this, there are cases where you have activist groups or the government of a country like Cambodia, not necessarily Cambodia, it could be someone else, will just approach the museum or a big collector and say, we have evidence, this is dirty, could you please give it back? And there are cases where they do give it back voluntarily. What has happened more frequently and is almost certainly more effective is either the Department of Justice or state prosecutors in New York. So the district attorney in Manhattan has a very active team who works on art cases.
Okay.
They will approach a collector or a museum or an auction house and say, we have evidence these works are dirty. We would like you to give them back and let us send them back to the country where they came from. You can do that, and we'll do a nice press release thanking you. Or we can look at how else we might get them back if you don't want to do it voluntarily. And at that point, it's an IQ test, I think, where you'd much rather do this the easy way. But not everyone goes there. And so you do end up with litigation. You do end up with criminal charges occasionally. And as a journalist, I love litigation, of course, because it throws off all kinds of interesting documents.
Yes.
Yeah, anything that ends up in court for us is fantastic.
Yeah, it's the journalist's friend is litigation, that's for sure, when you're working on a story. What about, were there any Indiana Jones kind of characters you ran into in this world that are freelancers going out trying to find lost art or recover it or anything like? I had a guy on, reason I asked, I had a guy on here that his main thing is go out and run down stolen classic cars. That there's a big market in these stolen high-end $2 or $3 million cars. There's a market in this worldwide market in that. Did you run any of those kind of guys?
Yeah, on both sides. So there are two characters in the book who are of that description. One is a master thief, a guy called Tuk Tik, who was a former child soldier in the Khmer Rouge, who actually escaped the Khmer Rouge, which was impossible. No one escaped the Khmer Rouge. It's an unbelievable feat of survival that he managed to run away and he hid basically until the end of the regime. And then he emerged into this shattered society. Like Cambodia in the 80s was poor and violent on a level that's almost impossible to describe. And he needed a way to survive. And he figured out that he could steal statues. And he got very good at it. And by the end of the 80s, he was running a big organized operation with hundreds of people, big supplier to Latchford. And then there's another character in the book who intersects with Tuk Tik's story later, an American lawyer who was living in Cambodia, is living in Cambodia, he continues to, was hired by the DOJ in some of its early investigations to do some investigation on the ground, and then ended up working for the Cambodian government and became a really effective tracker of these stolen works around the world, which requires real detective work because you're matching up historical records, you're doing interviews with witnesses, you're looking for things that may have disappeared after they were sold once and you have no idea where they went. So it's fascinating and really complex investigative work.
Yeah, that would be. He has to have a lot of sources out there that will call him and say, "Hey, I got this. This is going here."
Exactly.
Just have to have a ton of sources, and then you got a language problem over there, and you got a culture problem when you're American over there trying to work with local people.
Yeah, he's a very interesting guy. His name's Bradley Gordon. He's lived in Cambodia 20 odd years now. He speaks enough of the language to get by. He also speaks Thai, which is helpful, and has integrated more or less completely. He actually became a Cambodian citizen. So he has really good links. And actually, it was probably essential that they had someone like that who could both interface locally and be the liaison with law enforcement in the US.
Yeah.
Because no one in the Cambodian system, or very few people in the Cambodian system, would have been able to serve that function. Whereas this guy's he's a US trained lawyer who knows how things work over here.
Yeah, he would be invaluable to be integrated in that culture, but also in the American culture too. That's really hard to find, I would imagine.
Yeah, totally unique figure. And actually, one of the things I try to do in the book is show how his story and Latchford's story have certain parallels, just in the opposite direction. Whereas Latchford was ripping stuff up, Gordon is trying to gather it up and bring it back. And similarly, they were both kind of intercultural interfaces between Asia on one hand and the US on the other, just for very different aims.
Interesting. Latchford now, what was his life, his day-to-day life like? Like, he lived in a small, large town or the capital or out in the country? What was his day-to-day life like?
He had a fascinating life. So he, despite being, I think, a pretty evil character, learning about his life was really interesting. So he came to Bangkok in 1956 when he was in his 20s. And the listeners who've been to Bangkok will know now it's like Tokyo. It's a massive metropolis. It's skyscrapers and luxury stores and all that. It was not like that in the 50s. It would have been, you would have really been embarking on quite an adventure to live there as a foreigner. But he integrated very well. He started a very successful business selling pharmaceuticals. A big part of his story also is that he was gay. And at the time, you could be not exactly completely openly gay, but much more open than you could be in New York or London.
Yeah.
So that was part of it. And he, at the same time as he was building this business, developed this total consuming obsession with these works of art from Cambodia. First, just collecting them, then collecting and selling a bit on the side, and then as a all-out dealer who became someone who ran a large commercial operation.
When are they going to make the movie? The gay American expat who is totally into the local society, then starts stealing or developing these networks to steal pieces of art and ship them back to New York and to London. You can't make that stuff up.
And there's another character. So Latchford was a Brit, but the person who came before him was American, an amazing guy who I don't think anyone's ever made a movie about. They absolutely should, called Jim Thompson, who came out of the OSS. So he had been dropped into southern France in, I think, 44, got 6 Bronze Stars, which had some incredible service record, and then was sent by the OSS, which then became the CIA, I think in 47, to Thailand to make sure that Thailand, newly independent or regaining its independence after the war, would be a U.S. ally. So Thompson did that. He eventually leaves the CIA and goes into private business. He's also a huge art collector and dealer and bought all these amazing pieces. He built this incredible house in Bangkok, which still stands. You can still go and visit. And then in 1967, he is on vacation in Malaysia, goes for a walk on a Sunday afternoon, and never comes back. Disappeared without a trace. No one's ever found so much as a finger bone. Just vanished from the face of the earth. And just a legendary character who I think deserves to be better known.
Yeah. He had stepped on somebody's toes, hadn't he?
That's one theory, yeah, that he'd made some enemies.
Like that.
Yeah.
He didn't just dive in a canal and go to the bottom and never come back up. I got to
No, I don't think so.
You got to have some help if you disappear totally, I would say. When are you going to start on the screenplay on all this? This is fascinating stuff.
Soon, I hope. There is a book to Hollywood pipeline, though it's easy to get interest. It's very hard to get anything made.
Yeah, that's what I tell people that all the time. I've talked to enough of you authors and guys will say, boy, they need to make a movie out of that. I'll say, I'm going to tell you something. Getting a book and all the way into a movie it's lightning in a bottle, capturing lightning in a bottle.
It's a very narrow funnel, and a lot of ideas go in one end, and a tiny number of films come out the other.
Yeah, there are. This is a really fascinating story. I guess it reminds me a little bit of who was the newsman, Jake Edelstein in Tokyo Vice, that kid that was the newspaper reporter in Japan that got
fantastic book.
In the Yakuza. Yeah, that was a really good book. Tried to get him to come on the show, and he's got his own podcast, I noticed now, and he never responded. I may have to try him again. I'd read his stuff, and it was just so fascinating. I'd like to talk to him. He's from St. Louis. It's only about 3 hours from here. But anyhow, so Matthew, what's your favorite story out of this book?
What I really enjoyed was understanding how the market came to exist. Any illicit market, if there's demand, the demand will be served. So that's true of fentanyl, it's true of firearms, it's true of classic cars, whatever. If people want it, there are going to be criminals who emerge to provide it. But I didn't really know, when did there begin to be demand for these objects? When did people in the US with money to spend really start to want them? And the answer, and this was a really fun and interesting bit of history to dive into, is it's a story about the 60s. That in the late 60s, what was going on in pop culture? The Beatles were going to meditate with the Maharishi in India. Transcendental meditation is taking off. The Hare Krishna movement, who, believe it or not, were founded in New York City. So suddenly, out of nowhere, and the Vietnam War has something to do with this too, out of nowhere, there's this cultural fascination with Hinduism, with Buddhism, with India, with Southeast Asia. And that then feeds into what people want. It feeds into what museums want to show, and it feeds into what collectors are willing to spend big money on. And so I had a lot of fun in the book kind of tracing that history and how it lined up with Latchford's business and his ability to source these amazing, totally stolen objects.
Yeah. It's just a source of narcotics. If there's the demand out there, somebody's going to appear. And if there's no demand, that guy, he's going to have to go run a cab company or something.
Do something else. Look at how many tens of billions of dollars have been spent trying to stop fentanyl coming into the U.S. And it still comes because people still want it.
Yeah. And how much press about people dying from fentanyl, people just touching fentanyl and dying. It's ubiquitous. It's all over the place, but yet there's a demand for it, and it's going to keep coming. That's for sure. And the same way with that artwork. I would imagine that in modern times, that artwork is probably that trafficking in artwork like that is slowed down a little bit. Do you see any difference in current times? And it's probably rocking and rolling in the 60s and 70s around the war.
So it's changed. It would be a lot harder to move an obviously stolen piece into a big museum or a big auction house now than it used to be. For sure. However, every time there's a war, art gets stolen. It's one of the first things that happens. currently in Sudan. There have been tons of art and artifacts stolen. It's happening in Ukraine. It happened in Syria. It happened in Iraq. When the US military got into Iraq in 2003, there was this period between when the invasion started and when the country was under control and secured of a few weeks. And in that period, all kinds of archaeological sites were cleaned out. All kinds of museums were cleaned out by people who knew what they were doing, who knew what to look for. So we don't really know where a lot of this is going, but clearly the demand exists, because if it didn't exist, the criminals wouldn't bother with thefts like this. And as I said, it is still going on. So there was a big Sudan last year, the National Museum in Khartoum was ransacked basically, and everything was taken.
Wow. Yeah. These governments, as they become less effective and there's no established order, and if you got museums, why, it'd be a no-brainer to go in and take them. And there's market exists. As long as that market exists, they're going to do it. That's crazy.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right, Matthew Campbell, The Man Who Stole the Gods, a true story of war, obsession, and a global art conspiracy. It's a really interesting read, guys. Matthew, I really appreciate you coming on the show. You got any last words here?
Just to say, the book is available anywhere books are sold, and I hope people read it and it inspires them to see the world in a new way.
Okay, Matthew, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Gary.